Okay? All right. Okay, thanks, Ken. I started introducing myself while we were waiting, but...
So, this is Nanci. So when are you getting your PhD?
I can do it if you want.
No.
So I have about 6 months left.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm doing my PhD at the University of Toronto. And so my focus is nutrigenomics, which is a fairly new field. My background, as I've said a few minutes ago, so I've been working in the health, nutrition, fitness industry for 20 years. I am a registered dietitian, strength and conditioning coach, and my focus has been with elite athletes for the past 12 to 14 years. So Olympians, professional athletes, national teams, and that's the focus is elite advanced sports nutrition for high-performance athletes. And yeah, excited to bring this into the field. So I was introduced to. That's good, Ken. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. I know you're a busy guy. Yeah. So I actually had a eureka moment about 4 summers ago, and I saw my PhD supervisor present at the annual meeting for the Dietitians of Canada, and his topic was nutrigenomics. And I thought at some point I want to go back to school and do my PhD, but there's never a good time to sacrifice 4 to 5 years of your life and go back to student living, especially after you have, the house and the mortgage and all the, the lifestyle to be a student again. And so I just thought, a light bulb went off, and I thought, this is the next big thing. This is the future of nutrition, is being able to align our diets and our training eventually according to our genetic variation. So really listening to our DNA, which is the last word. There's nothing more unique about you or more individual than your DNA. And so I went up to him after his presentation. I said, have you ever thought of doing research in sports science, sport nutrition? And he said, well, we don't have a sport person in our lab, but certainly that's on the radar. So yeah, just talked to him for 2 weeks later and went ahead and started my PhD, started my research. And I'll actually be showing you some unpublished data of my research at U of T. And that's pretty exciting because there's not many training studies out there where we've looked at genetic variation and we see differences in performance. And that's something the field needs to do more so with regard to athletic performance. Okay, so I'll get going here, and we'll save questions to the end. So again, a lot of my research and my focus is on high-performance athletes. Of course, body composition is something important to this audience, but often I will be referring to performance as well. So as a disclosure, I am on the Scientific Advisory Board for Nutrigenomics, which is a genetic testing company in Toronto. And any of you that were in Dr. Morrow's lecture yesterday, I think there were some negative things said about genetic testing companies, and I'd just like to clear the air. This company is funded by the University of Toronto. It's the only company in the world that's funded by a major university. It's the sole provider to Life Labs. It's also used by Cleveland Clinic, which obviously a very highly regarded medical facility. And there's no way that there's any multi-level marketing or any shoddy science going on. If you look at the Scientific Advisory Board behind this company, they're global researchers, world-renowned. And my PhD supervisor, who's the founder of the company, is the most published. If you look on PubMed, he has over 100 peer-reviewed articles in nutrigenomics. And that's different from other entrepreneurs, business people that are trying to capitalize on this and have these pop-up companies that often don't last long. And they're trying to get your money and base it on not the strongest research. And I know there's companies out there, just like supplement companies. Across the board, you can't necessarily trust every company, but you have to do your research, look at the background, look at the Scientific Advisory Board. I also do some research for Cliff Bar. So what's on the menu today? I'm going to talk about, obviously, nutrigenomics, the background, the science, how this applies to health, fitness, and body composition, future applications to sports nutrition. I'll also talk about exercise and sport genomics, where we don't have quite as much science. So as of now, we can't really be designing training programs based on your genetics. And again, any company out there that claims to do so is stretching the science and really not respecting the current state of science. So I would say that borders on being, fraud is a strong word, but it's definitely inaccurate at this point. And then I'll go through my research, again, my unpublished data, and show you some exciting results of this randomized control trial I did with over 100 athletes. So today's sport environment, we know, is very competitive, and athletes really need to gain a competitive edge. And many athletes are looking for different ways to do this, and certainly we know with the recent scandals globally that this often is taking the doping path, and we see this, of course, with Russia and their attendance at the Rio Olympics. But certainly one aspect that's been overlooked is really looking inside ourselves and looking at our differences in DNA. And maybe that is the competitive edge we need, is to individualize and personalize. So instead of having the same diet and the same training program for all athletes or all teams, or if you're working with a certain coach and everyone getting ready for a competition is having the same macronutrients, the same foods, we know this isn't going to work for everyone. This is the assembly line approach. It's the easiest, the simplest, and I see this going on all the time, even with professional sports teams, as they're doing the same thing for every individual, and they're not considering that everyone is an individual. So what's your goal? Whether it's getting gold at the Olympics or it's achieving your best in a physique competition, you need to personalize. And if you really want to get ahead, you have to look at what's right for you. And genetic testing is going to allow you to do that to a more detailed and precise degree than you have seen and that we've all seen in the past. So this is a position statement put out by the American College of Sports Medicine, as well as the associations of dietitians in the US and Canada. And this was this has been updated from 2009. And a focus we have in this position statement is that nutrition plans need to be personalized to the individual athletes. So this was a theme throughout this document, where a key word was responses, individual responses, whether it's to foods, nutrients, diets, training, supplements. We need to consider these individual responses. So this is a schematic that I'm going to demonstrate how important the response is. So this is how nutrigenomics works. Basically, we have an exposure to a certain vitamin, for example, maybe vitamin A in carrots, to a certain supplement, caffeine or creatine, to vitamin C, to omega-3 fats. And so we look at these, the exposure, we test one of these at a time. And through genes that we know affect the metabolism or the response to these nutrients, we'll see what the differences are in health or performance. So this is the difference in response we're going to see that depends on genetic variations. So basically, there are within certain genes, we have places on our DNA where we can have variations. So they're called genetic variations or genotypes. So often you're one of 3 genotypes. And this means that if we're looking at perhaps your response, your performance response to a supplement, or if we're looking at your needs for vitamin D or iron or vitamin C, we can see that maybe you have an increased need for a certain vitamin or mineral, or maybe you have a decreased need for saturated fat when it comes to body composition, or perhaps there's no effect. Depending what your genotype is. So this is really the foundation and the basis of nutrigenomics, is identifying genes that affect a certain nutrient or food or medication or a training protocol, a therapy. Every different exposure we have in life, we have a unique response. Some of us respond different to stress, to certain medications, to sunlight, to weight training. Not everyone gains muscle at the same rate. And this is due to your unique genetics. So just keep this in mind, that for the most part, we can be one of 3 genotypes, depending on the gene we're looking at. So I like to show this normal distribution. This brings you back to a little bit of statistics, but not too complex. And what we see here with macronutrients and vitamins and minerals, we have our recommendations based on a normal distribution. So we look at what the average need is, and then we have our standard deviations above and below that. And we can see that most people fall within this blue area. However, many do not. And that's what we try and look at in genetics. Are you an outlier? Are you responding differently than the norm? And some of you may know that you do. Some of you that are lactose intolerant or gluten sensitive, or you need more of a certain nutrient to have the same outcome. That's something, it can take years through trial and error, but as a screening tool and beforehand to know up front what your genetic variation is, to see, do I need something different than the normal recommendations? So if we put a team, or if we put these 4 fellows on the same weight training program, we give them the same diet, the same macros, same amount of calories, their meal timing, certainly we're going to see a different response. These guys look fairly similar, but let's just pretend that they have differences in muscle mass and maybe 3 to 5% differences in body fat. We know that if we put everyone on the exact same training protocol and diet, that we are going to have different responses. And this is in your DNA. So just to sort of go back to some of the naysayers and some of the where we see some people often outside of the field saying, well, you can't identify talent using genetics. And that's true. We can't be testing children, even though they do in some countries, and say, okay, we know who the next Usain Bolt is. We know who's going to be the next world-class bodybuilder. We can't, at this point in science, identify future talent, nor can we individualize training programs. This is true. However, when it comes to nutrigenomics, the science is much farther ahead. And this is an opportunity for nutritional programs and dietary advice to benefit athletes and those of you, whatever your goals are in your fitness or whatever competing you're doing, to align your diet to your unique genetic variations. And this is via, of course, the science of nutrigenomics. So even though we have most countries in the world that are investigating genetics to a certain degree, we have whole conferences that look at talent identification, again, the science isn't there. So it's important that we don't determine what's going to happen in the future. The evidence is lacking. However, there are many things that we can do to work alongside our DNA. Certainly with diet, a little bit with training, a lot with injury prevention. We have some very strong evidence with some genes that show you have a risk of tendon injury, especially Achilles tendon injury. And I'll tell you right now, I had 5 athletes that went to the Rio Olympics, and I also have 4 professional hockey players and 1 professional UFC fighter. All of them in their genetic test showed that they had the highest risk for Achilles tendon rupture, and all of them have had an Achilles tendon rupture. So it's also nice to see when we do the testing, it's aligning with what we see. But certainly if these athletes knew ahead of time, this is how we would modify their training to be careful with the Achilles tendon. We also have many genes that show some need more psychological support than others. People have genetically different levels of motivation to exercise, as well as different levels of a pain threshold. So someone who sort of seems wimpy on the team or can't handle the heavy weights or can't push themselves, this actually can be genetic. And so you have to see what athletes might need more psychological support than others. So again, can't identify talent, but we can look at these modifier genes, these genes that are modifying how we're responding to foods, nutrients, and supplements, and align our diet based on that. So genetics, of course, has long been suspected to influence our response to diet and training. And you hear coaches all the time, good genes, bad genes, this athlete had great parents, this athlete not so much. But we have now been able to demonstrate this scientifically over about the past decade, the past 10 or 12 years, and especially the last 5 years, there's just been a surge in research in this field. So again, those unique responses to nutrients and taking personalized nutrition to a whole new level, beyond what you're currently doing, looking at it to a degree that we've never been able to measure before. So I take my athletes, I look at their unique sport goals, and that for you, your body composition goals, whatever your goals are, and look at your DNA, and then I can design diets that are much more precise than I was doing in the past to optimize that body composition and performance. So what are we doing now? Basically, Okay, we'll just hope that goes away. So general nutrition recommendations are based on sex and age. So if you look at this stadium of, at a baseball game and you see there's 60,000 people there, basically you have the same recommendations as every other male of those 60,000 in that stadium. And we know that that simply isn't the case. There's much more individualization that we can see in our day-to-day lives, and certainly we do see that with genetics. Oh, sorry. What is going on here? I'm not sure how to get rid of that.
Press escape on your mouse.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So what should we be doing? Obviously considering our genes and our DNA. So factors of impacting sports nutrition. This is those of you that don't work with clients on a daily basis and design nutrition programs certainly can see the complications here. There's so many things to consider when we're planning a diet, and this just gets even more complicated when we look at not only what the goals are, but the energy balance and the emotions that are involved. Every time you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, how you're going to eat, what you're going to eat, involves many of these factors. And this now becomes further complicated by up to 50 genes that are affecting these pathways. So you can see that this gets very complex, but now we also have genetic variations to look at that can help us determine what is the best path for this individual. So just to give you a better understanding of what's going on with the genetic variation. If you remember from high school biology, we had our DNA helix, the double strands, and we know that the proteins that are combined are the A's go with the T's, the C's go with the G's. And that's consistent throughout your whole genome, your whole DNA strand. And this, of course, we decoded the human genome about 13 years ago now. And now we know basically the code for humans, what our DNA looks like from start to finish. And then we also are now able to identify certain variations. So differences in these proteins or nucleotides produce genetic variants, and these are called SNPs, and that's a word that you're going to hear thrown around frequently, and this stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. So that just means that one of these single nucleotides is changed for another. So instead of having an A, it could be replaced with a C. So at that ladder in the helix here, instead of having an A and a T, you're going to have a C that could join with a G. And so this gets a little bit complicated, but basically know that we inherit 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent. So if there's a place where there's a variation where an A has changed to a C, you're going to get 1 letter from each parent. Depending on what your parents are, you could end up being an AA, a CA, or a CC. And in addition to that, other genetic variations we call insertions or deletions. So some people from each parent could get a deletion and a deletion instead of an A and an A. They could get an insertion and a deletion, so half the gene is inserted, half is deleted, or we could have a double deletion. And that'll just come up in samples coming up in a minute. So just to bring you back to this schematic, so genotype A, therefore, let's say it's TT, so it's those 2 letters, genotype B, TA, the last one AA. So remember, you're going to have an individual response depending on your genotype. So these letter pairs are the genotypes. And sometimes 2 genotypes behave in the same way. So maybe A and B both create an increased need for iron or an increased need for protein. Or B and C both show that you have an increased risk of heart attack with more than 2 cups a day of coffee, which is a sample I'll show you in a minute. So much of what we've learned in nutrigenomics stems from research in coffee, and we know for decades the research that came out with coffee, is it good or bad for me? It was very inconsistent. So one study would say it's bad for you, the next study would say it's fine and there's health benefits. And it wasn't until research done actually in our lab a decade ago, which was published in JAMA, that again showed here that depending on your genotype, if we look at these hundreds of thousands of people and we stratify them or individualize them based on their genetics, we can see who is at risk of heart attack or high blood pressure. And this is based on a gene called the CYP1A2 gene. And I just want you to keep in mind that for every gene, it's basically encoding an enzyme. So whenever you see, so the CYP1A2 is an enzyme that breaks down caffeine in your liver. It also breaks down various medications, substances, toxins. But whenever you see it in italics, it means it's the gene and not the actual enzyme. So graphically, we can see that if we look at the reference of 1 cup, we can see that those with this genotype actually have health benefits when they consume coffee. So anywhere from 1 to 3 cups a day, they actually have a lower risk of heart attack. This is half the population that has this benefit. And then if they have 4 or more cups, they're actually at the same average risk. Now, if we look at the slow metabolizers, which are both these genotypes, we can see that there's up to a 4-fold risk if they have more than 4 cups a day. And this research was done on cups being about 80 milligrams, 100 milligrams of caffeine. So what the recommendations we give is that if you are a slow metabolizer, you shouldn't have more than 200 milligrams of caffeine a day, which is basically a grande Starbucks. And many people are consuming much more of that than that. So what makes a great athlete? We thought in the past that genes were beyond our control. We know what's in our control, but we can also use our genetic variation to modify what we're doing here that's in our control. So I'm going to give you some specific examples now. So let's look at saturated fat. Saturated fat it's still associated with heart disease. Even though the research is coming out, it's not as bad as we thought. Butter's not as bad as we thought. Certainly, there's still some associations to LDL cholesterol, and that's actually beyond the scope of this presentation, and there's various opinions out there. But when we look at the largest sets of data, there still is some risk, and it's something that we don't want to just have a diet of 50% saturated fat. But more importantly, if you're looking at body composition and performance, we know that some people are more prone to overweight or obesity or a higher percentage of body fat when they're consuming a diet high in saturated fat. And this is dependent on a gene called the ApoA2 gene, and this is coding for the ApoA2 enzyme. So there's always a relationship here, usually to an enzyme. And so when you do a genetic test and you find out which variant you are of those genotypes, you'll know that if your body will allow you to consume more or less saturated fat, and that's going to be associated with your ideal body composition. So basically, high-fat diets such as the ketogenesis or getting fat adapted. I work with lots of endurance athletes, and of course that's out there controversial. Any of you who know Tim Noakes or who happen to be follow him or me on Twitter. We're in constant debates about athletes that can use fat as a fuel, and certainly you can at lower intensities. But when it comes to body composition, it's important to know what genetic variation you have in that certain gene. So body composition, we know, is highly correlated with performance, obviously in bodybuilding and in physique competitions. It's critical, but we know for all athletes that strength to weight ratio is very important, and you don't want to be carrying extra body fat. So those with the elevated genotype, the elevated risk genotype, we know we have to keep them on the lower end of saturated fat. And there's no benefit of having more saturated fat and less of the poly and monounsaturated fat. So there's no drawback to consuming less saturated fat. And when I'm working with athletes or any of my clients that are looking to if they have a certain quota of calories, to me saturated fat is like an empty calorie, because through de novo lipogenesis, we can actually make saturated fat out of other fats. We do not need to consume it in our diet. We can get plenty of them within our body by consuming, the body can make it through parts of chains of other fats. But again, with this genetic variant, we see in the research that there's a 67% risk of obesity or over fat in those that have the genetic risk. And this study stratified these populations with over or under 22 grams of saturated fat. And so remember, 22 grams of saturated fat is not that much, especially if you're looking at a paleo or a high-fat, low-carb diet. A lot of these diets can actually be quite high in saturated fat. So if you have the risk variant, and this is through genetic testing, those that are consuming more need to make the switch to a lower intake of saturated fat. So this doesn't mean all fats. This is particular to saturated fat. So some that are following the paleo type just need to watch the sources. So protein is a very interesting one. Stuart Phillips is a good friend of mine. He's at McMaster, and any of you who know the name know he's like the guru in protein and muscle science. And he has the most publications globally with regard to training muscle mass and how much protein and what type you need. And certainly we hear the promotion of high protein diets all the time, and that's the best for weight loss, for muscle gain. Of course, we need enough protein, but research, again, looking at these genetic variations, shows that some people actually will do better on a moderate or a lower intake of protein. Now, this isn't going below the RDA. We're talking the difference between 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight versus approaching 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So it's still enough protein, but the higher amounts actually are shown, and I'll just show you graphically here, that those that consume the high protein diet, you can see that with the difference, just if you have this genotype, how much fat loss occurs versus this genotype. So you can see if you have this genotype, a high protein diet is actually going to do you a disservice. And so you need to know what genotype you are to see how much protein as a percentage of your diet or grams per kilogram. So I'm just going to go back to that slide for a second. So I'll make sure I covered all of this. So yeah, we certainly we hear all the time we need to protect our lean body mass, which is true. But when it comes to that fat loss, again, this sort of was touched on in the panel yesterday. It's important to know what your goals are. In all cases, we want to protect lean body mass, but certainly if fat loss is the goal and you're happy with your current amount of muscle mass, then you really need to know what you need to do with your protein. In order to have the greatest benefit to your body composition goals. So this here is sample test results. So if you'll get a little paragraph on the importance of protein. This talks about the gene that affects protein and the sources, of course. So this is generally, it varies between different genetic testing companies, but you'll get a lot of information that's been interpreted for you. So usually through a healthcare professional is the best route to go. Direct to consumer, there's a little bit more gray area on the interpretations. So it is important that it's been interpreted properly. And so basically, again here, and this is just obviously the genetic test I use with my clients. So here you can see how common your genetic variation, what it is, what this means to you. So this person has enhanced fat loss from a higher protein diet. So the recommendation is this much from their energy, as opposed to if they would do better on a lower to moderate, then we would look more at the 20 to 25% of caloric intake. Now, those of you that work with grams per kilogram, that's obviously how we work as sport dietitians and those that are looking to be more accurate. Percentage becomes pretty useless. And my best example of this is I was a bit of a trader for a couple of years. I was working with the Russian Olympic Committee and preparing the athletes for Sochi. And so some of these cross-country skiers that are training 7-8 hours a day, a lot of them were training up to 8 hours a day, consuming 7,000 to 8,000 calories per day. When we look at protein percentage, we had them at 7 or 8% protein. That was still plenty. That was still 150, 175 grams of protein. So certainly someone who would hear, 7% of your diet's protein? That's way too low. It really depends on your energy expenditure and total calories. So if I'm working with a gymnast that's living on 1,400 calories a day, a petite gymnast, and depending how she's training, maybe she's only consuming 1,400, 1,500, 1,600 calories. Her percentage of protein might be 30%. But again, if we're working with someone who's burning up 5,000 calories a day in carbohydrates and needs that for fuel, this percentage changes. So it's very important to use grams per kilogram. when you're working with on an individual basis and knowing the calorie requirements. So just some other examples. Probably many of you have come across people that say, oh, I have a slow metabolism, or this person can eat what they want, they have a fast metabolism. And us professionals in the field think, oh, hogwash. Don't give me this slow metabolism stuff. You're eating too much, you're not exercising enough, you're not training hard, you're eating more than you think, whatever it is. But actually now, there is some truth to that. And we do know that there's a gene that's affecting your metabolic rate. And so when I give recommendations to clients, I know when we're looking at a calorie deficit, I have to approach a daily deficit of closer to 700 to 800 calories a day with my client, as opposed to sort of the traditional 500 we aim for through extra exercise and diet. The combination seems to have the best outcomes. So it is important to know if you're working with someone that actually does have a slower metabolic rate, and it is going to be more difficult for them to lose body fat. And this, at least if you know up front, it helps you, comply with your diet and sort of helps you understand better what's going on with your body. And this isn't huge. The difference is about 150 calories a day, difference in metabolism. Of course, that doesn't sound like much on one day, but after weeks and months, 150 calories a day really adds up, and that's many pounds of body fat over months. So now on to vitamin D, which we know recent research over the past 5 years or so, we know that vitamin D is not just about bone health. This can impair muscle action, increases the risk of age-related muscle loss, decrease in muscle strength with deficiencies. And we know in studies, randomized control trials, when given vitamin D supplements, we know that muscle strength can improve, recovery can improve, especially after high-intensity training. And this gets down into, some of the molecular levels. But we do know that there are vitamin D receptors all over the body. This isn't anymore just about calcium homeostasis, which 10 years ago we thought vitamin D was just really about calcium and your ability to absorb calcium and how much. So low vitamin D is going to not only affect your bones, which is important to have adequate bone health, but certainly in your training, you're not going to get as much out of your training. So any time that you can't recover, it means you're being held back from progressing as quickly as you could otherwise if you had sufficient vitamin D. So we do have a gene that, two genes in fact, that are affecting your ability to absorb or metabolize vitamin D into the active form. So we have the CYP2R1 gene that's encoding, again, that enzyme, and it activates vitamin D, so your body has use of it. And then we also have the GC gene, which encodes the vitamin D binding protein and transports it to tissues. So if you have the genetic variation that inhibits these pathways, you actually will need to consume more vitamin D in your diet. So there's two things you need to do. Know your genetic variation, and you also have to do the blood work to know your current status. Nobody knows their vitamin D status. No one in this room knows unless you've done recent blood work. So the only way to know for sure is to see what your status is. If you're deficient, if you're insufficient, or if you have sufficient levels. And I really advise everyone to do this because vitamin D is not technically a vitamin, and it is something that is stored in fat tissue, and it is not something, it's not water soluble. So therefore, we don't want people overdosing, and you can't just say, well, I probably, I want to build muscle, I'm just going to take 5,000 IUs a day. That can be dangerous. So it is very important to know your current status, and then know, do you just need 1,000 a day, or maybe do you need 2,000 or 3,000 IUs a day? The standard is pretty much 1,000 IUs. Everyone can take safely. That's going to take you out of deficiency, but it might not be enough. Again, depending on your genes and depending on your current blood status. So again, this is just graphically, we show the risk. A very significant risk in both of these genes if you have this genotype here. And again, remember I said that some genotypes can have the same effect. So we know with these two these two genotypes, both these groups of individuals would have an increased risk of vitamin D deficiency. And in here, it's just the one genotype. So every gene we look at has the research behind it. So we're looking at often hundreds of thousands of people and seeing this response across different ethnicities and seeing how this plays a role in the outcomes of whatever goals you have that are affected by vitamin D and across all the nutrients. So vitamin B12, I'm actually working with more vegans than ever. So I know that we have others at this conference that think vegetarianism and veganism is just outrageous. It's not. I work with one of the best UFC fighters in the world. He's a vegan. I have 4 power athletes that went to Rio and competed. 4 of them are vegan. They've been vegan for at least 10 years. A couple of them lifelong vegans. I do have 2 bodybuilders. Well, one's a friend I give some advice to, and the other I work with them. We've done the genetic testing. Both of them are vegans. So we're talking about competitive, successful bodybuilders with a ton of muscle that do not touch animal protein. So it can be done. I just wanted to put that out there. And so it depends. I mean, that's another personal preference. But here, B12 is, of course, something you're getting from animal products. Vegetarians are at higher risk of being deficient because they're not consuming as much B12. But also, if you are a non-vegetarian, if you are eating animal proteins, you also have a risk of being B12 deficient if you have this genetic risk. And so B12, we know, is important for the formation of red blood cells and other things in the body. And certainly any vitamin or mineral that you're going to be deficient in is going to make it more difficult for fat loss and more difficult for muscle gain, as well as just general health and energy. So whatever your goals are, if you're not healthy, it's very difficult outside of a pharmacological approach to lose weight or to lose fat mass effectively. Of course, we know that some people do it in an unhealthy way, but that's not a long-term solution and certainly something I don't advocate. Iron, this has been very valuable. A lot of female athletes I work with do have a history of low ferritin anemia. But this is for both males and females, that there is a genetic risk of iron metabolism and iron absorption, again, due to these certain genotypes that are posing a higher risk. And this has been a great screening tool because some athletes that I have that are going to the Olympics in 6 or 8 or 10 months or going to the World Championships, we don't have to have time to fiddle around with a diet and eat more lentils and dried fruit or eat more beef. We don't have time for that because this is an ongoing problem that we need to jump to a supplement right away. And on many occasions, we've had to jump to IV iron, so intravenous iron, to sort of get over this hurdle that's posed by this genetic risk. So what else is affected by your genes? Certainly we know in the research, companies that are sort of going outside of this, there's not enough research to give accurate, proper recommendations. But we have not only vitamins and minerals, but we have, again, our response to certain fats, to protein, even to your carbohydrate sensitivity or your starch digestion. So we know some people are going to have more of an insulin response to starch. This one is actually very related to body composition as well. So some people do need to be more careful about carbohydrates, as well as more careful about saturated fats. Knowing your genetics is very important when it comes to those macronutrient percentages. And I know many clients that I've worked with, and myself too, I've tried the high fat. I've gone super low carb thinking, okay, this is it. Everyone's doing it. So many people are having success. And it didn't work for me. 3 times I was, religiously adhered to it. And all 3 times I actually gained weight. And this was, a couple of years ago before I'd done this test, it wasn't available. And sure enough, my genetics showed me that I would have better body composition, achieve my optimal body composition on a low-fat diet. And that's generally what I use, and it does work for me. And this is, N equals 1. We can't be using anecdotes or sample sizes of 1, but that's my experience, and that's been my experience with many clients and with many athletes. And we all know people that respond well to a high-fat diet, and we all know people that don't. And that's the problem with diets that work for one person is you have such great results that you want to spread the word to the world and say, okay, everyone should follow Atkins, everyone should be keto. And that's not the case. You have to know not only how you're training and what your training demands are and the need for carbohydrates depending on the intensity, but you also need to know what fits your genetics. Not everyone is built the same, and that's a really important message. We also can look at things that are affecting, as I alluded to earlier, motivation, bone health, your power potential, which I'll get to in a second, and like I mentioned before, pain tolerance. So these are basically some of the most scientifically evident and well-researched areas that we know that genetic variation will help us design some training, but for the most part, diets. That are going to help us achieve our goals. And even the excessive snacking. So there's actually a gene, I mentioned this yesterday on the panel, that shows that some people are better able to balance their energy or have greater hunger in a shorter time frame. So some people can easily go 3, 4, 5 hours without eating. Others, it's every 2 hours. And certainly those that are training harder, they have that increased appetite as well, but also genetically. You want to know if I do have some athletes that they'll forget about eating. They're not hungry and 5 hours goes by. And meanwhile, they have 2 training sessions in a day. And it's like, listen, you got to eat. You can't be going 5 hours. You're not going to make it through your next training session unless you get on top of that post-training meal, or certainly having something within that 5 hours. And something important that's also overlooked with genetic testing, this is a study done by a PhD student in our lab who's now at Harvard, continuing her research in nutrigenomics. And she showed in a randomized control trial that those that were given genetic information compared to just general nutrition recommendations actually were more motivated to change their eating habits, and in fact a year later were following a diet more closely, the ones that had their genetic information, compared to just the regular one-size-fits-all approach. So there's 2 other studies since this that have shown that, and that's very important. And any of you who are practitioners, you know that behavioral change is the biggest hurdle we face. Getting people to exercise more, eat less, eat the right foods. It's not that you don't have the knowledge. Most people know what they should be doing. It's, how can we get them motivated to do so? And we see this, I can attest to this myself and with my clients. When you open up your results that have analyzed your personal DNA, I did have accelerated heart rate when I was opening it up to see, what are my results? What this is me. I am opening this PDF file, and this is revealing my unique DNA. And I tell you, this really gives people a jump in their motivation and their ability to adhere to the results and the recommendations. So how do genetic tests work? There's basically 5 steps with most genetic testing companies. Again, do your research. Just like any, the variability we see with doctors, lawyers, car salesmen, supplement companies. Do your research on the company, know what's behind it, know the researchers behind it, and also how they're handling your data, and if it's private, if it's encrypted and protected. So I'm going to go through these 5 steps. The first, it's either, we don't use blood anymore. It's a very quick saliva sample, 1/4 teaspoon of saliva. Some labs are using the cheek swab, which actually has been shown to have mistakes, so it's not 100% accurate. But this saliva sample is accurate 99.2% of the time or something, so very accurate. And if it doesn't work the first time, it will on a second sample. We haven't, out of thousands that the company I work with, or the genetic test I use, it's in, I think, 32 countries now, over 3,000 clinics, and there hasn't been one that has come back that we weren't able to analyze someone's DNA. So the saliva sample is sent to the lab for analysis. And then the results are uploaded to a secure server. This is very important. You want to investigate where your DNA information is. It should be just with an identifier or an anonymous code, so an ID number. Your name shouldn't be anywhere, and it's good to talk to the company to see what their process is, because again, not all companies are the same. And then you're going to get a personalized report. Again, this is a sample of the report I use. Some are different. And you want to be careful of who's interpreting these results. Like I said, some entrepreneur or business person that decides that all of a sudden they know how to interpret genetic information into nutrition recommendations, you have to be careful. What's their interpretation and how are they interpreting the science? This science can get very complex, and not anyone can just go in and say, okay, your gene shows this. This is what this paper said. This is what we're going to put in our report. It's important to know the strength of the evidence in the research that they're using. How many people? Was it different ethnicities? Who are the researchers behind this study? I've seen some really shoddy science published in inferior journals that are showing, again, how you can train better according to your genetics, or how people that are having things to do with carbohydrates, because they know that it's sensitivity to sugar. There aren't, the way they're interpreting the results is not how the science has been, it's not what the science measured or what the study measured. So it's very important, again, to know the researchers and the scientific advisory board behind the company, because of course we know that people are uptight about sugar, and they want any information they can get about sugar. So if you see a DNA test is going to tell you how sensitive you are to sugar, of course that's going to, pique your interest. Lastly, and I showed this earlier, you're going to get your sample report, and it's going to personalize, what you need to do for you. And then best to meet with a healthcare professional. So 23andMe is the largest genetic testing company in the world out of the US, and they test for diseases and all kinds of things, and they actually were shut down by the FDA because they were handing out these reports, and people are freaking out thinking, oh my God, do I have to go get a double mastectomy because I have like the Angelina Jolie breast cancer risk gene, or this shows that I have early Alzheimer's. And people can't, most people in the general population don't have the ability to interpret the results, and there's panic. And that's why the FDA shut them down and said, you can't just be handing out this information without a person sitting down with the appropriate healthcare professional who can interpret the results. And also one thing to keep in mind with nutrigenomics, so testing for personalized nutrition, we don't predict disease. And we know that that is sort of one of the setbacks we've had with disease prediction. When we decoded the human genome 13 years ago, we thought in a decade for sure we're going to have the cure to cancer, to obesity. We're going to know all the genetics behind the risk of all these diseases, diabetes, and we're going to have cures for everything. It's more complex than they thought with regard to disease. And we know that there are thousands of genes responsible for obesity or for heart disease or for diabetes. But that's not what we're doing in this type of genetic testing. We're showing that your ability to metabolize certain nutrients are modified depending on your genes. So you, again, need more or less of a certain nutrient. And this can eventually predict your risk of disease. So if you're not metabolizing starch very well, eventually that might increase your risk of diabetes. But this test isn't looking at your genes and saying, okay, you have an elevated risk of diabetes or an elevated risk of Alzheimer's disease. That is a whole different field of genetics, and the science isn't there yet to tell you what your risk of these certain diseases is, beyond some like Huntington disease or early onset of Alzheimer's disease. And we know that one of those proteins can actually be responsible for that early Alzheimer's, which is very scary to know. Some people choose not to. But again, I didn't mention this with just those single proteins like the C and the A. Just the difference of one of those proteins, where there's thousands, is the difference between blue eyes and brown eyes. Okay, so a lot of people that a lot of these naysayers that say, oh, there's so many thousands of genes, responsible for muscle gain or for obesity or for heart disease. Yes, that's true. But we know we can identify these single areas like celiac disease. We know that people with celiac that consume gluten, it can be fatal. And this, again, is only the difference in actually about 4 areas where there's a difference in those letters, a C to an A or a T to a G or whatever it may be. And so you can have very significant, what we call phenotypes or outcomes that you measure just off a difference in one letter or maybe a few letters. So it's very different than the thousands of genes that we know predict height or they predict intelligence. Like there's things that are so broad that we haven't discovered all the genes. I think they've discovered maybe something like 10% of the genes that determine how tall you're going to be. So it's not just one letter. But with regard to how well you cycle vitamin C and if you need more or less, it is one letter. And we have the evidence and the research to show that. So it really depends what you're looking for. And just to recap with a company, it's important. One thing I see companies out there, we look at 150 genes. It's important to look at the quality and not just the quantity. And also, are the results actionable? Can I take this information and do something with it? Or are you just telling me, I have a higher risk of obesity? Well, that doesn't help me. What do I do about that? Is there something that I can take action on? With regard to diet, these are things you can take action on. So I'm just going to, can someone just let me know the time? Everyone at once, 10:24. And so, okay, great, we're good. So just some sports nutrition examples. So, Andy Jones, if you know the beetroot research, you know that even his Twitter handle is Andy Beetroot. He's done a lot of research in this area, in the nitrates in beetroot. Certainly with these popular supplements, we know that we're having different responses. And I'm just going to give you some examples of maybe how we can look at some of these other supplements and see how genetic variation can help us with designing sports nutrition products or future supplements, the needs based on your genetics. So anyone who's more involved in endurance sport would know Asker Ukendrup. So he's the carbohydrate king and a world-class cyclist and Ironman athlete himself. And he's a very well-published researcher in the area. And he's the one that came up with the idea that we could actually absorb more carbohydrates with a combination of glucose and fructose. So in the past, we've always heard 30 to 60 grams per hour during intense exercise. Well, it turns out you can actually metabolize and utilize more carbohydrate if you combine glucose and fructose. And so we see here in these studies where the performance is better, you actually have more fuel available to you if you do the combination, and you have a better, so these are time trials where you actually have a faster time if you had the combination of glucose and fructose. So how did genetics come into play here? Well, we know, remember, you're going to be one of 3 genotypes. So we know that the ability to absorb glucose has a maximal capacity. So if you hit the maximum, you can't actually take in more glucose to be used for fuel to your working muscles. What you want to do is rely more on fructose. So we know that genetic variation here will determine those that have a higher maximal capacity to absorb glucose and those that have a lower. So the future of sport drink formulation is going to allow you to have more or less glucose or fructose. And again, we also have to consider some fructose malabsorption, which is related actually to other genes. But certainly we already have some large companies, companies like, some of the big, Pepsi, Coke that are formulating sports drinks. They're already sort of 5 years ahead thinking what's in the future, what are we going to design in the future. They're on top of the marketing. They have these think tanks that are looking at the next greatest thing. And this is really going to be, you're going to see it coming to vending machines near you where you scan your barcode and you're going to have a new vitamin water based on your genes, not just the vitamin water we see currently, which is nonsense. and has lots of sugar. But certainly we can get our vitamins and minerals from food. Not the best idea to get it from these drinks. But certainly, supplements, sports drinks, protein powders, whatever it is, we'll see in the future that it's going to be designed based on your genetics, which is as personalized as you can get. We also see this with a gene responsible for lactate clearance. So everyone knows the feeling of having a lot of lactate or acidosis in the muscle, and that is going to be your limiting factor often, depending what you're doing, and the onset of fatigue. So we know, I know this gets complicated here, but you can just see that this MCT1 enzyme is elevated when you have an increase when this is elevated during intense exercise, you have an increase in the production of lactate. So this gene is related to lactate clearance. And so lactate clearance occurs by the slow twitch or aerobic fibers being able to pick that up and use it as fuel. And we know that some people have a genetic variation that shows that they have up to a 65% reduced ability to clear lactate. Now that's really important for you to know if you have that genetic risk, and that means that you're going to have to start using some buffers, whether it's beta-alanine or some type of bicarbonate. Many people don't respond well, and of course, well, any of you in endurance sports would know that we have the nausea and vomiting with too much of the sodium bicarbonate. However, you're going to have to learn to adapt to that, or you're going to be left behind in competition. It's very important to know what your genetic risk is with this lactate. And this is something I'm hoping to find in my data, because I did 350 Wingates with my athletes, so each of them did 3. And so I have the lactate numbers so Wingate test is a 30-second all-out test. They use this in the NHL, for example, just to see your power, your anaerobic capacity. Very intense test, produces a ton of lactate, and I see a lot of differences among the 114 athletes that I analyzed in my study, the differences in how fast they cleared the lactate. Some of them cleared it all in 20 minutes after they're cycling with no resistance, clearing it out by the slow twitch fibers picking it up. Others, it took up to 45 minutes, and they still had high levels in their blood. And so this, I'm going to hypothesize, is due to this gene. And so we'll get more information. This I just added in. It's not really my area of expertise, but I came across it when reading just some studies in the journals, as I have to do every day. And so I thought this was very interesting with so with regard to steroid detection. So we know that in doping control, they're always trying to figure out the best way of seeing how someone is escaping these positive tests when, they are taking banned substances. And so this is a very interesting gene that those that have the deletion, so remember I said some people can have insertion, deletion, or insertion, So we know that that in doping control, what they want to look at is the ratio of this testosterone to epitestosterone. And so depending on your genotype, this study showed that these 3 doses were given, and if you had the insertion, or so if you had just at least one insertion of this gene, you actually had a positive doping test. So you had a positive result with this T to E ratio, this ratio of the test to epitestosterone. But none of the subjects who were devoid of this enzyme, so had the deletion, reached a positive test, which is a ratio of 4. So if you, and this this really shouldn't be like what I'm advocating, but those that would like to know how their tests show up, this is one of many genes that's going to show the possibility of a positive test for steroids, and something again that some people might be very interested in knowing. So it's not just about nutrition. It gets into, what a lot of the, bodybuilding and NFL community are interested in. There's many natural bodybuilders, but of course we know that many have additional help. Okay, so what about training? Very early. It's intriguing, but it's 1 to 3 years before some major trials are going to come out and show us that how can we train differently based on our genetics. One well-researched gene is the actin-3 gene, and if you have sort of the double insertions of the actin, the protein that produces the actin in the fast-twitch muscle fibers, we know you're more likely to be better as a power athlete. I'm going to get into that in a second. But beware of genetic tests that are providing these algorithms that are telling you, looking at 15 or 20 genes and saying, okay, you're better to train this way, higher reps or lower reps, no matter what kind of athlete you are. The evidence is not there. And I had the privilege of presenting my research at the American College of Sports Medicine in Boston in June, which is the most prestigious sports science conference in the world. And so one of the best researchers, David Bishop from Australia, who is a global leader in looking at this, we co-presented in a symposium, and he said, his lab is doing this research, and we're just not ready to do that. We cannot design training programs based on your genotype. Yes, we know people respond differently, but how to design a training program based on that, we don't know yet. So just more about the actin-3 gene. I'm not going to get into too much detail. You're going to have this available to the slides that I'm going to provide. We know that the RR, or in the letters, it would be the CC, TC, or TT. The X stands for null, meaning you're not getting that protein that's producing the actin in your fast twitch fibers. We know that having the sort of the double protein is associated with elite power athletes, and globally we know that all of the highest level world-class power athletes in the world have this CC genotype. Now, many that are at a lesser level, or they do sports that require some power but not 100% power, many of them will have the CT, or sort of half that protein available. And then we know that the null one, where they're not producing any of that, often they are better at endurance, and they have an increased ability to increase their function and numbers of mitochondria with endurance training. So the heterozygote is also a little bit consistent, whether this is better or not as far as what sport you're involved in. So this again is just showing you some stats on Olympic sports and what is the breakdown of what genes they tend to have, compared to the general population. We know that these two types, so having full actin or sort of the half actin producing ability, is benefit for power sports and endurance. As far as endurance athletes, you do get some benefit from power, because remember, even if you're an ultra marathoner, you still want to break away from the pack. You still have a hill. You still need to sprint. And we know elite marathoners that are running just over 2 hours, they're just at their lactate threshold the whole time. So they're certainly using a lot of their power fibers, and that becomes important, to have the ability to generate more power. But you can also, this is a good indicator of people you see in the gym that are just working their butts off and they don't build mass. They are likely not to have this ability. And if they're the null genotype, they're going to be the, the Atlas guy? Who's the way back? Charles Atlas, the guy with the little unit that he was trying to build muscle. Some people are just not going to build the muscle. And this is, of course, what we see in endurance athletes that are training for strength and they're not building mass. And that's a benefit. You don't want to be carrying around loads of muscle if you're trying to run 100 kilometers or do an Ironman. So we do have some data, though, that does show that your response to bench press, for example, if you do have that double protein producing ability, you're going to have a much greater increase in your bench press than someone that has that more of the endurance type. And many of these studies, many more are needed to be done. These are in smaller groups, certain specific populations. We can't extrapolate this to everybody, just like we can't extrapolate animal data to humans. It's very important that enough studies are done and replicated before we know for sure what's going on. And even if we do know this information, does this mean we train someone in the 6 to 8 rep range or the 8 to 12? Should they do 6 sets or should they do 2 sets? Should they have 30 seconds rest, or should they have 60 seconds rest? There are so many factors when designing strength training programs, depending on your sport goal or your body composition goal. We can't design training yet, but we're getting a lot of information on the response based on your genotype. I'm just going to skip over that for now. Just as far as where the research is headed, because we need such large sample sizes, there is these consortiums that are being established worldwide where we're looking at populations in Poland, in Russia, in China, in the US, different places in Europe, where they're able to have sample sizes now of 20, 30, 40,000 athletes where we have the data. And that can mean that we can be more sensitive to seeing changes rather than working with a sample size of 200 athletes or 300 athletes. So depending on what you're looking at, sometimes you need these huge samples, which you just can't get at one university or one state or in one country. So why do genetics matter? Just to go back to the studies on beetroot, for example, we can look at this data and see that, okay, well, it doesn't look like beetroot or nitrates were really benefiting this group in this study. However, there were 2 responders. So I'm sort of tired of reading research where it states, well, our overall average response was this. However, we had those that did way worse and way better, but we're just going to, say that in our concluding paragraph and end of story. That's not giving us the whole picture. I need to know what's happening with my individual athlete. I don't need to know what's happening with the Canadian Olympic team with regard to how they respond to caffeine. I want to know the 3 athletes that I'm working with that are going to Rio. I want to know how they respond to caffeine or to creatine or to a high protein diet. We find another study here, where there's we see that there was 2 responders, even though the overall conclusion of the study didn't consider that. So again, we see often in studies over the past few decades, whether they're testing HIIT training or high or low volume, or again, the rest periods, or a high protein diet and muscle protein synthesis, different supplements. Well, we see significantly greater or lesser responses in some individuals. This is probably due to genetics. And that's a real problem with research when you don't see the individual raw data. So I'm just going to show you a hypothetical typical time trial using caffeine or placebo. So this is a typical caffeine study that you would see. How did caffeine affect how fast these athletes were able to go in a 10, 20, 30 kilometer time trial? So we look at 100 subjects and we see an average improvement of 42 seconds. So those that took caffeine compared to placebo actually were able to cut 42 seconds off their time. And this was a 10 kilometer, so about 15 minutes. Okay, so we see like maybe a 3 to 4% improvement. But what about the subjects who did way better or way worse? So I'm just going to show you the data of, so we want to find out who are these outliers, who are the responders and non-responders. So if we look at this typical data set, or the typical outcome we would see published in a research journal, we would see they went faster by about 42 seconds, an improvement of about 3.5%. But look at the individual data, okay? This is a mess. It's all over the place. This is our median line that's often published where we say, on average, they improved by 42 seconds. You can clearly see not everybody improved by 42 seconds. Some did worse, some improved only by 10 seconds, some did better by 60 seconds. Okay, so we need to know what is that individual data. And when we look more closely, we see actually only 58 out of that 100 improved. And we see that 9 actually had no change in their performance under caffeine compared to placebo. And then we see that 37 worsened. So again, if you're working with an athlete, an individual, or you're wanting to know what you should do for you, you need to know, am I going to do worse or am I going to do better? Who am I in that individual data set? So here I'm just going to quickly run through my research. And so everyone knows or is familiar with caffeine uses in the field, especially in endurance sport. We see a lot of these energy gels or blocks, or using flat Coke towards the end of an endurance race, or just using traditional coffee. A lot of these pre-workouts you take before going to the gym, of course, contain caffeine. And so caffeine has its there's consensus now that the effects of caffeine are basically occurring in the central nervous system, and this is primarily through the antagonism of the adenosine receptors, where the calming effects of adenosine are blocked, and you get the stimulating effects of caffeine, and this is resulting in an increase in dopamine, and primarily we get the benefit by having a lower perceived exertion. So you can actually work a little bit harder than you feel like you're working. So that brain to muscle message is under caffeine conditions, it's not feeling quite as difficult compared to when you are not ingesting any caffeine. However, this is not true for all athletes. And if you look at the general consensus in the research, you say, well, yeah, most studies show that. However, not all, and that's what I want to further investigate. The same as looking at heart disease, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, or blood pressure. Is coffee or caffeine going to have a negative health impact or not? So I want to look at caffeine as far as athletic performance. Is this going to have a negative effect or a positive effect or no effect? So I'm just going to, for the sake of time, run through this quite quickly. In endurance sports, we tend to see the most benefit of caffeine. When we look at for example, the outcome of London, same as in Rio, it's less than a 0.01% difference. So a 3% difference by using caffeine is huge. Any supplement that we see a benefit by 1, 2, 3% is huge, but because you can see the marginal differences in, this is almost a 6-hour race, and they're finishing less than a second apart, the top 20 people. So it's very important that you're addressing these marginal gains. And even if genetics is just going to account for maybe 1% difference in your performance or your ability to achieve fat loss, that's huge. If we consider all the factors we have control over, we certainly don't want to exclude ones, even if they do have a small impact, because we see that those small impacts can win or lose races. Why that keeps happening. Okay, so with power sports, we see only about a quarter of the studies are showing a benefit with caffeine. However, there's not as many studies done when it comes to power or strength sports. Again, looking at that individual response. So you're probably very familiar now with this schematic. I looked at this specific gene, the CYP1A2 gene, which determines your metabolism of caffeine, whether it be fast or slow. And so there's 3 genotypes. And so out of my 3 genotypes, I wanted to see, is this going to result in a faster time trial, have no effect, or be slower? This is one component of my study, the endurance component. I also looked at strength, power, and anaerobic capacity. So my objectives were to look at, as I just said, power, strength, anaerobic capacity on 2 different doses of caffeine versus placebo, and determine which genes may affect this. I still have 22 more genes to look at, and I still have to look at the rest of my parameters. I've only looked at aerobic performance right now. So this is randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled within subjects design, means that every subject did every intervention. So one day you were on placebo, the next time you came in 2 milligrams, the next time 4 milligrams. This was all randomized. I didn't know what dose they were on, they didn't know, and out of 100 subjects in this particular analysis, that's what was measured. So these 100 athletes came in for 3 different sessions and in a randomized fashion. So the treatments were visits 2, 3, and 4. Visit 1, I did the VO2 max test and just took some of their anthro data. Actually, sorry, that's probably on my next slide. So the intervention, as I mentioned, double-blinded, random order, placebo-controlled. So 114 athletes, because of some dropouts and injuries, there was just 100 left that had 100% clean data. These were athletes of all different sports, and I included them as long as they were competing. So I initially was just looking at Olympic sports, but things like Dragon Boat and CrossFit and Ultimate, these are very competitive and have a lot of athletes I didn't want to exclude. So again, just visit 1. This is the data I collected. I did the VO2 max test to see what resistance we should use in their time trial. Treatments 2, 3, and 4, again, were the different doses of caffeine versus placebo. So we had them wait for half an hour for the caffeine to kick in, and they completed 4 exercise tests, always in this order. Okay, so the first was vertical jump to measure power. The second test was a hand grip as a surrogate measure for strength. For the strength athletes out there, I know you would rather use like a 1 rep max of bench press or squat, but didn't have the means to do all that, because we have to make sure that we do all these tests within a certain time frame of when that caffeine is in highest in the bloodstream. The Wingate I was mentioning, this is a 30-second all-out test, produces a lot of lactate. And finally, we had our 10-kilometer time trial, and this is the outcome measure of the data I'm going to share with you. So these are just my subject characteristics. They did have a higher BMI because of muscle mass. So again, when you look at the general population, as you know, this could be approaching overweight. We know that that doesn't apply to athletes, and certainly to power strength athletes or bodybuilders. Many bodybuilders would be considered obese. And the VO2, if these were all endurance athletes, this would be much higher, above 60. So I had power athletes in here, power lifters, dragon boat racers like soccer players, hockey players, so a lot of different athletes. So if it was just cyclists and triathletes and marathon runners, this would be above 60, just for those of you that are familiar with the VO2 values. Okay, so here is my results of just caffeine, not considering genetics. So I found that there was a 3% improvement in caffeine, the difference between 0, so placebo versus 4 milligrams, but it didn't reach significance. We know in studies that we're always looking for a P of 0.05 or less for it to be significant. So for a lot of the research that's been done over the past few decades, that would just be like, okay, fine, caffeine doesn't work, let's go home, end of day, research finished. Well, remember, we want to look at individual data and we want to look at genetics. So when we look at the genetics and I stratify my population into the 3 genotypes, these 2 genotypes are considered slow metabolizers. These are sort of ultra slow. These are medium slow. These are fast metabolizers of caffeine. So I see that the interaction between genetics and caffeine shows that my fast metabolizers are going to improve very significantly. Look at these p-values in the fast metabolizers when we look at 0 versus 2 milligrams and also 0 or placebo versus 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. And this is looking at that CYP1A2 genotype, which is measuring your or categorizing you as a fast or slow metabolizer of caffeine. So this is a very important message to those that would just look at the study results and say, well, it wasn't significant. Caffeine didn't benefit this group. Well, 49, you know what? Sorry, this is those percentages, these are backwards. The slow is 8% and the fast are 49%. So, darn, this is an old slide that wasn't corrected. So it's the fast metabolizers, which were 49% or 49 people in this study that actually went faster. And the population is stratified that way. So half of you in this room are fast metabolizers, half are slow. Whether you're ultra slow or slow also matters, because even though this wasn't significant, we can see that the ultra slow metabolizers actually look like they did worse. So here's just a different way of looking at the difference between placebo and 4 milligrams. I found that the fast metabolizers, these percentages are correct now, that they went 1.2 minutes faster on average when using 4 milligrams of caffeine versus placebo. If you were a slow metabolizer here, you went 0.5 minutes faster, which was negligible. That didn't reach statistical significance. However, if you were an ultra-slow metabolizer, you actually went slower on caffeine. Now, most people wouldn't think that that would be possible. You wouldn't think that you could actually do worse on caffeine. But this is what this data is showing and highlights the importance of genetic variation. So just to summarize what I found there in just that one component of my data, I've only analyzed about 10% of the data I have, which is thousands of Excel sheets, basically. Not everyone benefits from caffeine. Your ergogenic or performance enhancement depends on your genotype, and we see that it's just fast metabolizers as far as endurance. I'll still have to look at my power, my data from my power and anaerobic capacity and my and the strength. So no performance was benefit was seen in the slow metabolizers, and it may be worse. Even though that didn't reach significance, that's probably because I only had 8 subjects in this data set that were ultra slow. So if I had 30, maybe that would have reached significance. So it's all about sample size and statistics. So critical information for athletes high dosing caffeine. And just to bring you back to heart health, at least this is consistent that caffeine is actually good for your heart. You have some health benefits, as well as you're going to perform faster, you're going to be faster as far as endurance goes. It's negligible, and it might be a risk to your heart. Certainly here, you're going to perform perhaps worse. And again, these 2 genotypes are showing a risk of higher blood pressure and heart attack if you're a slow metabolizer. So at least I didn't have the result where you're going to get a performance benefit, but you might be damaging your heart. So that was good news. So next steps, looking at the different placebo and caffeine with power, strength, and anaerobic, and I'm going to look at 22 more genes. So the implications, as you can imagine, identifying responders and non-responders, what's an effective dose, is 2 enough, is 4 adequate? Most of the literature looks at 6 milligrams. We know that's too high. You can see the same basically in 5, often in 4. I want to see what's the lowest possible dose I can use with my athletes, especially if they have a risk to their health, to their heart. Okay, so identify what sports are going to benefit more. Future directions, we're coming to a close here. I know it's a lot of information. Testing other genes. So we also want to look at beetroot, look at nitrates, look at creatine. We know, I'm sure all of you have experienced responders and non-responders to creatine. And that's genetic variation, how creatine is metabolized, how it's affecting the muscle cell and the volumizing of it, or how that's affecting muscle protein synthesis. So I just want to acknowledge my lab as far as my research goes, my funding sources, and then just some other nutrigenomic resources. And you'll get all these slides except for my actual data, which is unpublished. And I believe that brings us to a close. And thank you for your attention. Questions? Yeah?
For an average person, where would they go to get this testing done? Timelines and costs involved?
Okay, well, here is this where I get to give a plug to the company. You can talk to me after. So as far as the test I use and the one that's the company that's from the University of Toronto, it's a simple saliva test that you can do. You can go to the website and you can find a practitioner in your area. Right now, it's just available through dietitians. We're opening it up to naturopaths, coaches. We're doing an official launch. I'm just heading to a conference later tonight to Boston, where we're doing a launch of the Sport Panel genetic test. It takes about 2 weeks, so simple saliva sample. And also any practitioners in here can also be providing this test to their clients. The company provides training and education, and because all of the report, I have a sample report with me as well. Because it's all been done, you can use it with your clients without having this greater understanding. All the interpretations have been done for you. So just a small amount of education. But yeah, you can get the test done. You can talk to me right now. We can arrange to get the saliva collection kit mailed out to you. It takes 10 seconds. You spit into a tube, you mail it back, and your results come within 2 weeks. And yeah. And it looks at 45 genes. Again, I can show you more details of the report of what you find out. Yeah. So it's actually, and I do have a promo code. It's $350, and if you're a practitioner providing it, it goes down to $298 if you register with a company. But we have a promo code of Swiss 2016 that you can actually get $100 off the test until the end of the year. So going from $350 to $249. I think it's $348 to $249. So a savings of $100. And you can talk to me, or you can just email the company, or I have business cards and can tell you more about that. And then the good news as well, as more research comes out and more genes are looked at, you can, at a very discounted rate, you can get more information. So if we find out more about response to sugar or fat or to other vitamins or minerals, since once we have the DNA, we can test that or add those new well, it's a whole process. But anyway, we can add that information and send it back to you. So rather than just having the information on 45 genes, we're planning hopefully in the next couple of years, it should be 100 genes. Maybe in 6 months, another 10 genes. But again, it's the quality of the research. And that's what's important. If you see other companies using 100 genes, I can go through them with you and tell you which ones are BS and which ones are good science. I mean, that's all I've been doing day and night for 4 years. So, it's important to talk to someone who's in the field. Question?
That's why you chose the 45. My question is why those 45?
Yeah, those 45 because they have the strongest evidence, right? So there's some that the scientific advisory board had to look through and say, do we feel that there's strong enough evidence to say that we can say that, give an interpretation and give a recommendation to someone and say, listen, this is showing that you need more vitamin E, and this is going to help with whatever the research showed. And there are some that look at different vitamins and minerals, but it's not strong. If you have one research study that looked at 80 postmenopausal women in Italy, and you see of the strength of evidence they found, we don't want to add that to our test. We can't be providing this test worldwide to athletes, or there's a health and wellness test as well as the sport test. We want to make sure it's strong and it's going to apply to you and to whoever's using the test. And that's where research becomes complicated and critiquing research. And I know the naysayers sort of have, people that don't understand the field think that, oh, there's 25 genes. How could one gene have any effect on what you should eat? Well, it does. We know that, no, we can't tell you what your risk of obesity is, and we can't solve that problem because there are thousands of genes. But I can tell you that we know the 2 genes that are going to affect your ability to metabolize vitamin D. And we know right now that you're an individual that needs more vitamin D because of this. And those are things that we do know now. The evidence is there. It's clear. But we don't have evidence for a lot of things, and that's why the field is growing. It has to start somewhere. But using, again, and I really caution you on those that tell you how you can train based on your genetics. The top researchers in the world will tell you the science isn't there. We know that there are differences, but we don't know how we would translate this into training programs. But that should be coming in the next 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
Well,
there's one more question, but
was
I
there
can answer.
one?
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask, you said, is that the price that you said, 250 or 350?
Yeah.
Include the consultation with the practitioner?
No. So that is something that if you're looking to be a practitioner, you charge what you want on top of it. That's the actual lab fee. So that's when I work with a client, I would charge $125 just to do a simple consultation of 45 to 60 minutes. If someone wanted me more so to look at a 3-day food record, so it just goes up from there. So anyone who does nutrition consultations knows that you can sit with a client for an hour for a certain fee, but if you want to look at a 7-day food record or a 3-day food record, or you want to get all into their goals and get into more detail, there's an hourly rate or different packages. But I will tell you, if you want to look at the report, I was part of developing that report, and that was hundreds and hundreds of hours of PhDs in the field, dietitians, and so we took all that information and interpreted it into the recommendations. So you'll look at that report and think, wow, I don't even need someone to interpret this for me. It's all been done. And that's the hours that have gone behind it. And that's the difference between just getting your genotype. If I sent you a report and said, oh, you're a CC in this gene, you'd be like, what the heck does that mean? But if you have the report that says, oh, you're a CC, you respond this way to saturated fat, so you should have this much, and these are the foods, and this is what you should do. So we've done all that hard background work for you, and there's also 24/7 dietitians available at the company who can answer your questions. There's videos, the company's coming out with all kinds of courses and actually continuing education that you can get through CamPro and SCA and all the continuing education credits by taking the courses and learning more. So yeah, there's lots out there, but I can talk to you more after.
Okay, on behalf of Swiss and everyone here,
I'll
I
answer
want
you.
to present you a gift.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.